Thank you for joining us for this episode. Today we're joined by Dr. Paul Chamberlain. We're going to be speaking about insights on MiSight on the Myopia podcast.
Optometric Insights Media proudly presents the Myopia podcast, where we give you the latest myopia research, clinical topics, and industry insights. Make sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of our awesome myopia content. And now to our host, a massive myopia manager himself, Dr. David Kading.
Well, thank you again for joining us for this episode. Today we're joined by Paul Chamberlain, and Paul works with CooperVision and has been the brains of the operation by and large with his team around MiSight and what's come about it. Paul, it's an honor to get to have you on the Myopia podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. Good to catch up.
Yeah, likewise. Paul, give everybody a little bit of a background of how you got into eyeballs and how this all evolved to get to where you are today.
Oh, that's going back a ways. So I'm an optometrist. So yep. I trained at City University in London in the late 90s. And after a few years in practice, I saw a small little classified advertisement that said, simply, contact lens research, no Saturdays. And at the time, I had a season ticket for Chelsea Soccer Club and wasn't able to go to many of the games. So I went, I quite like contact lenses. Why don't I take that up? So, I went. That was a job with a professor named Michel Guillon, who did a lot of contact lens research for contact lens companies. And so I did that for a few years. I also worked at Eurolens Research, which is Philip Morgan's research unit at the University of Manchester, really kind of doing general contact lens research for industry. So, contact lens research studies that you'd see in the trade and peer-reviewed press. And then an opportunity came, and as those years progressed, I really became fascinated with contact lenses as a product and how to make them better, and really wanted to get into the industry side. And so an opportunity came up for a job at CooperVision, and the opportunity to move from rainy Manchester to sunny California didn't meet any objections in the family. So that took me about 13 years ago to CooperVision. and I worked on a lot of research projects, including MyDay and MyDay Toric and Avera Vitality. And then the 1 year data came in from the MiSight study, and it was pretty clear that I would need to focus my time on that study and that project. And so I wasn't here I hadn't quite emigrated when the original protocol was being developed, which tells you how long these things take to get off the ground. As soon as the data started coming in, we realized that the result was significant enough that we were spending a lot more time on it.
Yeah. Maybe if you don't mind, can you give us a little bit of the background of the MiSight lens and how it first was designed and created for myopia management, and how that kind of all came about?
Yeah, so I think it's well known that the original design was developed by John Phillips, another British optometrist based in Auckland, New Zealand, and I think CooperVision had long been interested in the area of controlling the progression of myopia. And we're actively searching for technology, and the Philips design was one. And so there was a partnership and ultimately a licensing from the University of Auckland of that technology. And once that was licensed, obviously that was on the basis of a relatively, in myopia control terms, short clinical study. Mm-hmm. And so CooperVision obviously realized that in order for this to be a product that really helped to grow the market, that even back then, so we're talking 2010, 2011, that they realized that there have to be a large scale multinational clinical study in order to, one, prove that it worked over multiple years, and obviously two, to meet what we predicted would be the various regulatory hurdles to actually get it indicated for the slowing of progression of myopia. And so, so from that original discovery of the design to then scaling it up to a day disposable material as well, of course, and then a large scale clinical study.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what was it kind of in that 1 year data that started to come out that really sprung you into action? And what were those early studies kind of like that you started saying, hey, we're going to now launch this as a product worldwide? And, not to mention, and we don't even need to get into this because this is a whole 5-hour podcast of alone getting it through the FDA. In the process of having to do that, which Cooper really spearheaded that for being the first myopia product in the United States. But how did that all come about?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, so the results were obviously incredibly strong at 1 year. And so forgive me if I don't get the numbers exactly right, but something like 0.4 of a diopter and I think 0.15 millimeters or something like that.
Yeah.
Difference between the two groups in what we knew as well was an incredibly well-controlled, well-run clinical study. So you've got a combination, I think, of a pretty big effect at year one in a very well-run clinical trial run in multiple centres. And so that was really, I think, the driver for. It sounds like we weren't paying any attention to it. We're paying plenty of attention to it. But obviously, the 1 year data, you've then got something to actually dig into and understand and so on. Whereas while the study's being set up and children being recruited, there's not much on the industry side that you can do. Just wait for the results. And so, it was really the combination of the size of the effect that we were seeing, plus the confidence that we had in this data that made us start to talk about it more, and realize that, yes, this is going to be a product that we're going to be able to launch. And so, but then, of course, you still have to wait because you again, there's been plenty of studies that have shown an effect after 1 year that unfortunately don't continue into years 2 and year 3. And so,
Sure.
You have to understand, is this effect broadly across the population? And then ultimately you're looking towards, okay, when is our next point where we can confirm that this effect is continuing, knowing that we would need 3-year data at least to take on the FDA hurdle that you alluded to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you had that data around the world. I mean, MiSight was launched in other countries before it was in the United States. You gathered that 3-year data. And what were some of the things that seemed to really stick out in that data? And then ultimately, we're going to get to the 6-year data, which is pretty exciting. But this 3-year data that was like, yeah, we've got something here. We can move forward with the FDA.
Yeah. So the European launches happened after the 2-year data. And so we were already confident that this effect was continuing to accrue. And we were looking at different ages within that study population to check that effect was sort of fairly consistent. And around the time of the 2-year data, the FDA had a sort of an open workshop on managing myopia. And when you look back at the transcripts of that workshop, the criteria that they had for us rings pretty true to that. So they were expecting, the workshop was concluding 0.75 diopters or thereabouts of an effect, or 50% continued over multiple years, and so on and so forth. So, the framework of what might be an approval was sort of identified somewhat in that panel or open workshop meeting that they had around the time of the 2-year data. So we had some idea of what it would need to be. in terms of what really stands out, so obviously meeting that threshold was something that we were really focused in on with the 3-year data. And again, and it feels almost like a lifetime ago now, but again, some of those things that were, question marks in the field is, are you still going to get accrual over years 1 and years 2 and years 3? Are you going to see a commensurate effect, not only in the spherical equivalent slowing, but also in the axial length slowing? And obviously, the correlation of axial length growth to spherical equivalent progression is really, really strong in the 3-year data. So those are the sort of things that we were really latching onto at that time to say, we as an organization and responsible are confident in this data, because you're seeing because think about that spherical equivalent and axial length correlation that we saw. That's 4 different clinical sites, multiple children, with 2 different instruments at each of those sites being measured by different investigators, and then those 2 results are absolutely correlating, right? There's every reason for them not to line up like that. You're talking about young children being measured in different parts of the world on different instruments, but they lined up so well. And so that was just a sort of another signal that this data was really strong and really reliable. So that was good. The other one, and it gets talked about a lot, I think, at that time on the podium, was when I looked at the number of eyes, or the percentage of eyes that hadn't changed by a quarter diopter spherical equivalent. So that was 41% in the MiSight group, 4% in the ProClear group. And so that to me was like, wow, that's nearly half the population. And you haven't clicked the phoropter in 3 years.
Pretty impressive. That's very impressive. It's almost life-changing for people who you're thinking about. That this population of people is going to have high risks for these major conditions, and we didn't even change the phoropter and the alignment with axial length. For those of people who say you can't do myopia without, axial length, well, you showed that evidence too. For those of us who didn't have axial length and those of us who do, pretty impressive data. Now the 6-year data came out a year ago, or not even a year ago, at the Academy last year and or so. But this was pretty profound data too, not just for MiSight, if I may. But also it teaches us a lot about what happens in myopia, because you've got a huge group of people that you've been studying for a very long time, just observing those that were in the control group and what was happening to them. And I know I'm getting ahead with all these questions, but you also studied what happened when we switched them and how did they respond, right? So just go on and tell us about this incredible results that came out in this 6-year data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right in just highlighting the fact that it's 6 years, right? And a lot of people have a lot of questions about myopia control, myopia management, and what we do and we don't know, whether that be in regulatory agencies or in the scientific communities, and that's understandable. And actually, it's probably a good time to point out that the MiSight study is the first one to go this long, so it's not surprising that there's still some unanswered questions, simply of the maturity of some of these trials. So I think right there, to know that the effects that you're observing are continuing through multiple years, I think, as you rightly allude to, is important for all of us then taking myopia management to give you a confidence that this is not a short-term effect. It wasn't an easy decision when we extended the study, and there was plenty of questions at the time as why not continue the control group, the placebo group. Right? You've had a really well-controlled clinical study, and why not just keep it going and see what the difference between those 2 groups would be after 6 years? And we thought long and hard about that, and sort of in conjunction with the clinical research organization that was helping us run the study and so on, but really decided that we had proven the effect of slowing the myopia progression, and
Yeah.
and maybe we used the word ethical too loosely, but we didn't feel comfortable basically asking these parents, and frankly didn't feel that when presented with a new consent form where you have to detail what you know so far, that they would even sign up for 3 more years of the control group. So we made that decision to switch the control group into the MiSight lens at 3 years, and perhaps thought, we've really missed an opportunity to go more than 0.75 diopters in terms of the effect size. But I think, as you allude to, we learned so much more, and one of the key things for that, and again, think about how likely this is in the future. How likely are you to have 3 years of really diligently collected axial length and spherical equivalent data on a group of young myopes without intervention and then intervene in the current climate, right? To be able
Are we going to ethically be able to do that ever in the future now, knowing what we know? Probably not.
Yeah. And so related to that, of course, you get to start to learn, at least in this population, in this age group, something quite important in terms of, because it's a population, so there's some fast progressors and there's some slow progressors and there's some medium progressors. And so how do different progressors respond when they get fitted with MiSight? And so in that 6-year paper is an analysis of that, where we simply plot progression rate against, in the first 3 years untreated, against the second 3 years where they're treated. And actually what we see is that growth rate in the second 3 years under treatment scales in proportion to their prior progression rate. And so basically that group fits a line of just over 70% that you've got age wrapped in there. But what it does tell us actually is that the faster progressors benefited the most because they had the most amount of slowing. So the ones that were progressing the most without treatment slowed the most in treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And actually the slower progressors, although their dioptric amount of slowing isn't that high because they weren't that high to begin with, virtually stop progressing completely.
Right. So you're showing that in fast progressors, you show a percentage reduction in the progression.
The whole population shows a percentage progression.
Yep. But in slow progressors, not always, but you're nearly halting completely. Yeah. Well, that's pretty profound.
It's hugely, because obviously the faster progressors are the ones that we're really worried about hitting high myopia and all of the associated complications. Mm-hmm. And so in a proportional effect model, let's just do something really simple. Let's just say it was not 70-something%, but it's 50%. Someone that's progressing by 2 diopters a year is going to slow by a diopter, by half. And someone who's progressing half a diopter a year will slow by a quarter diopter to just progress by a quarter diopter. So the benefit for the latter person is only a quarter diopter and the first person is a diopter. It's still 50%.
Yeah. No, I mean that is pretty profound. But did you show when you pulled out those 2 groups individually as opposed to a total for the whole group? Did you find, and maybe you already said this, but did you find that the faster progressors had what percentage of slowing?
It was everyone slowed by 71%. Right, so that's the fast and the slow. That's the trend line that fits the entire population.
For the whole population, did it shift when you pulled out the 2 groups to be different?
No, it's one consistent relationship, but of course, 71% has to be contexted by the fact that they're 3 years older in part 2. So your data from part 1, they're progressing much faster, but they're also much younger. So I wouldn't really call that, hey, MiSight in that new group has a 71% myopia control, because some of that slowing would have happened because of age anyway.
Yeah.
But it happens to everyone. But the result of that proportional slowing to prior progression means that the faster the progressors, the more dioptrically or millimeters they slowed in the second part of the study.
Yeah. Was there anything else in all of this work that you found fairly profound?
I think some of the most important things, I think, is some of the most simple, and that is the lack of adverse events, the lack of any slit lamp findings at all, and the really high rate of acceptance of these children over 6 years, right? So I've not really done a full literature search, but I would certainly bet that obviously 6 years is the longest continuous study of children in contact lenses. Yeah. It might even be the longest study of any population, prospectively, in contact lenses. I don't know.
I can't think of one that's longer with a group of patients of any age, let alone children.
And so, I think if there's high rates of acceptance, low rates of adverse events, and low rates of any biomicroscopic findings. I can't remember the exact figures. I put it in some of the presentations, but when you think about the poor investigators of this study, and you've got visits of baseline dispensing 1 week, 1 month, 6, 12, 18, all the way through 6 years, and you're looking at palpebral hyperemia, corneal vascularization, etc., there's something like 27,000 grades were made across those 6 years, something like that. Across all the different sites and all across the different population and visits. 27,000 opportunities to grade something a 3 or a 4 on a grading scale that we all use for contact lens studies, or sometimes even in practice, where a 3 or a 4 is, hey, maybe I'll take them out of lenses for a few days, just let things quieten down a bit. 5 times out of those 20-odd thousand opportunities was a 3 or a 4 found. So these kids are wearing contact lenses with no issues at all. And, I think there's so much you can take from that in terms of the strong safety profile of day disposable lenses in kids, the high rates of acceptance, because the kids in their day-to-day life aren't really thinking like, I can really tell that my axial length isn't going as fast as it did last year, so this is totally worth it for me. They're thinking about their life wearing contact lenses, the freedom that it brings them, and so on and so forth. And I think those results are really important. And again, it's sustained multiple years, that the benefits are far outweighing the risks at this point.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing your insights. I mean, I think we could talk quite a while with you about this, but in interest of your time, which I sure appreciate, we'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us. It's been awesome chatting with you, Paul.
And you, David. Great to see you again.
Yeah,
let's do it again sometime.
All right. And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Myopia Podcast. Stay tuned for future episodes. Like and subscribe so you can hear other great content on the Myopia Podcast.
This podcast was brought to you by Optometric Insights Media. If you enjoy our content, please leave a 5-star review. And don't forget to subscribe for more great episodes.